It was supposed to be just another sparring match, a quiet morning duel between two young warriors in the courtyard of their village. Rikuya Takeda, only 18, faced his opponent with the steady hands of discipline and the restless heart of a boy who still wanted to prove himself. The wooden posts around them cast long shadows, and the others watched without much concern. It was routine, controlled, supervised, until it wasn't. The sound came like a gunshot, a sharp, brittle crack. Steel gave way. A broken blade fell to the ground in pieces. Not just a weapon, but a legacy, split before the eyes of everyone. Gasps filled the air, followed by silence so heavy it seemed to crush the breath out of the onlookers. The rival's face flushed, not just with shame, but with something darker, the quiet promise of vengeance. For Rikuya, it felt like a strange, accidental victory. But in the world of samurai, no act is without weight. Breaking another man's sword wasn't just misfortune, it was humiliation, and humiliation demanded a price. By dawn, that price arrived. A lone rider crossed the misty hills, his banner bearing the seal of a powerful daimyo. He brought a message sealed in blood-red wax. The boy who shattered our honor must die. Deliver his head within 3 days, or your village will burn. And so, a single duel lit a fire that would threaten to consume them all. Could the survival of an entire village really depend on the life of one boy? It was the late 16th century, deep in Japan's Sengoku era, an age of fractured loyalties and endless war. In the fog-wrapped mountains of Kai province, nestled between rice paddies that shimmered like glass at sunrise, there lay a humble village. Smoke drifted from thatched roofs, the scent of damp wood and smelted iron hanging in the air. It was a quiet place, seemingly peaceful, but every stream, every footpath marked a potential border between rival clans. Among the boys of the village was one who carried more than just the weight of a sword. His name was Rikuya Takeda. Though only 18, he already wore the dark hakama of a samurai in training. Elders said he had his father's eyes, the same father who had fallen years ago on the battlefield, and the steel will of his mother, who toiled in the fields and raised her son with equal measures of discipline and quiet pride. To most, Rikuya was still just a boy, respectful, hard-working, intense in his training, but unsettled in spirit. He split his days between endless drills at the dojo and modest village chores, chopping firewood, fetching water, patching the wooden walls that held their fragile world together. Yet deep inside, something smoldered, a hunger to be seen as more than just the son of a fallen samurai. He wanted his own name, his own honor. It was during that daily rhythm of sweat and silence that the fateful duel took place. At first, it seemed no different than any other. Two young men testing their skill under the watchful eye of their master. But when his opponent's blade cracked in two before the gathered crowd, everything shifted. Not just for Rikuya, but for the village itself. That night, while families ate in quiet homes and laughter flickered around cooking fires, Rikuya sat alone with a cold bowl of rice, haunted by the stare his rival had given him, not of youthful anger, but of something ancient and deadly: dishonor. What he didn't know was that even as he sat in silence, the story of the broken blade was already crossing mountains. By morning, it would reach the ears of powerful men, and with it would come a decree that could doom them all. And that night, he would remember when he was still just a boy. That night, as silence fell over the village and smoke curled upward from the hearths, Rikuya lay awake. His body ached from the duel, His mind churned with the image of steel breaking like bone. He tried to close his eyes, but instead of rest, his thoughts carried him backward, into a time when life had been simpler, when a sword was nothing more than wood in a child's hands. He remembered the dusty courtyard behind the dojo, a place where children gathered to mimic the warriors they admired. The summer sun had already begun to sink, staining the mountains in a wash of orange and crimson. In that light, the laughter of boys and girls echoed as if it belonged to another world. And there, barefooted and wide-eyed, Rikuya squared off against his closest friend, Kenjiro. Kenjiro had never been meant for the path of a samurai. Even as a boy, he carried the earth in his bones, strong arms, quick laughter, the steady gaze of someone who knew the fields better than the sword. Yet on that evening, with two wooden bokken clutched in their hands, he became Rikuya's rival. Their sticks clashed with hollow thuds, strikes sloppy and wild. Rikuya attacked with all the seriousness of youth, brows furrowed, teeth clenched, every swing a declaration of who he wanted to become. Kenjiro, by contrast, danced away with exaggerated movements, laughing even as the wood cracked against his arms. "Faster, Rikuya," he shouted between blows. "If you move like that, you'll never be a real samurai." The words were not cruel. They were a dare, a spark that drove Rikuya harder. He swung until sweat ran into his eyes, until his arms shook. And finally, with a desperate lunge, his wooden blade struck Kenjiro's shoulder. The boy yelped, stumbled, and the two of them tumbled into the dirt together. For a moment, pain and triumph mixed. Then laughter bubbled up, louder than their mock battle had ever been. Side by side, still breathless, they stared at the sky. The last streaks of sunlight stretched over the horizon, as if the heavens themselves had paused to listen. Kenjiro turned his head, speaking softly now, no longer teasing. "If war ever comes here, I'll be by your side." Always the words landed heavier than any strike of wood. Rikuya turned, his face still smudged with dust, and answered with the solemnity of a boy who already carried dreams larger than himself. "And I will protect you. I swear it. By the soul of the sword I do not yet have." The memory blurred, like ink washed away by rain. Years had passed since that evening, and the boys had become men. Kenjiro had chosen the fields, while Rikuya had chosen the way of steel. Yet the promise remained, echoing louder now than it ever had. Lying awake, Rikuya could almost hear their voices again, woven with the crack of wooden blades and the laughter of a sunset long gone. And he understood. Soon, the oath of their childhood would be tested. Neither of them could escape the words they had spoken beneath that burning sky. The duel had ended, but the echo of steel breaking lingered like thunder in the hearts of those who had seen it. That night, the village did not rest easily. What should have been a small contest between young warriors had become a story whispered from one house to another, carried like smoke by every tongue. At the riverbank, where women bent over the flowing water to wash clothes, the tale was already retold with trembling voices. Some swore they had seen sparks leap from the shattered blade, as if the gods themselves had marked the moment. Others said they had never heard such silence fall over the courtyard, not even when death had visited the village in years past. But all agreed on one thing. A sword was not just a weapon. To lose it, to see it broken before witnesses, was worse than a wound of flesh. It was a scar etched into the spirit. Rikuya felt the weight of their stares as he passed. The women who had once smiled at him now turned their eyes away. Children who had cheered during sparring games shrank behind their mothers' robes. He was not celebrated for his victory, he was feared for the shadow it cast. Around the communal fires, men gathered with grim faces, their words sharper than any blade. The rival clan will not forget this. If their daimyo hears, blood will be the only answer. Better if the boy had lost than bring such danger upon us all. Each comment was a stone placed upon Rikuya's chest. He clenched his fists, but said nothing. Pride battled shame within him. Pride for the strike that had proven his skill, shame for the curse it seemed to invite. Meanwhile, across the valley, in the rival clan's camp, Hayato sat alone, his broken sword laid before him like a corpse. The shame burned hotter than fire. Other warriors avoided his gaze, though some smirked in quiet satisfaction at his disgrace. In that silence, humiliation grew into fury, and fury hardened into a vow. He would not rest until Rikuya's blood repaid the dishonor. Back in the village, the whispers only deepened. Some claimed Rikuya's strike had been too cruel, that it had gone beyond the limits of friendly sparring. Others whispered the opposite, that fate had chosen him, that perhaps he was destined for greater things. Between fear and awe, suspicion and admiration, the boy became a figure too large for his own skin. That night, as lanterns flickered against paper walls, Rikuya sat outside his home, listening to the hum of voices carried on the wind. None spoke to him directly, but he heard them all the same. For every word of respect, there were two of warning. For every murmur of admiration, there was another of dread. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his own blade, staring into the darkened sky. The stars were hidden by clouds, and the world seemed smaller, as though even the heavens recoiled from what had begun. A boy had broken a sword, but the village spoke of it as if a war had already been declared. And in the silence that followed, Rikuya realized something that made his heart pound like a drum. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the sound of steel snapping had been the sound of destiny itself, calling for blood. The next morning arrived not with peace, but with an unease that clung to the air like mist. Villagers walked quickly, avoiding Rikuya's eyes as if his presence alone could summon disaster. Whispers trailed behind him, not of praise, but of dread. Breaking another clan's sword was no longer just gossip. It was a shadow stretching toward war. By the dojo, Rikuya sat sharpening his blade, repeating a quiet mantra in his mind. The sword broke because it was flawed. But even he didn't believe it. Deep down, something inside him had cracked too. His opponent, Hayato, hadn't returned since the duel. The absence spoke louder than fury. Rikuya could still see the look in his eyes, not wounded pride, but a promise. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Rumors spread like wildfire. Women at the river spoke in hushed tones about the rival clan's temper, how they would never let the insult pass. Around the fires, old men muttered of worse things, that the daimyo himself might already know. Rikuya tried to drown it all with relentless training. His strikes against the straw dummy were faster, harder, desperate. But each blow echoed with a ghost, the sound of the sword snapping. He couldn't escape it. That evening, he climbed the wooden wall surrounding the village. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and a strange scent rode the wind. Smoke, faint but real. His chest tightened. Nature itself seemed to shudder. Far off in the darkness, nothing moved but owls. Yet within the home of his master, a candle burned late into the night. Hirotsune knew as well as Rikuya did, this was no triumph. It was an open wound, and before the moon could vanish behind the ridge, hoofbeats stirred the distant hills. A lone rider approached, bearing more than just a message. He carried the weight of a sentence no boy should ever have to bear. But, beyond the mountains, shame had another destination. Far beyond the fields of Rikuya's village, in the rival clan's stronghold, the night air was heavy with incense and smoke. Torches burned along the stone corridors, their flames licking shadows across banners that hung with the crest of fire. Inside the great hall, warriors knelt in silence as the sound of footsteps echoed over the polished floor. At the center stood Hayato, his head bowed, his broken sword wrapped in cloth at his side. The fragments of steel had been carried all the way from the village like the body of a fallen comrade. He had not slept since the duel. Shame gnawed at him, sharper than any wound. The daimyo entered, draped in dark robes, his armor polished, though he had not seen battle in years. His eyes were cold, like coals that glowed without flame. He seated himself at the raised platform, his retainers kneeling in neat rows on either side. The hall stilled, waiting. Hayato was commanded to approach. With trembling hands, he unwrapped the remains of his sword, placing them on the tatami before his lord. The blade that had once gleamed with pride was now nothing but shards, edges jagged, lifeless. The daimyo's gaze lingered on the broken steel, then rose to meet Hayato's eyes. The silence stretched, each second heavier than the last. Finally, his voice cut through the hall like an unsheathed blade. "Do you know what this means?" Hayato bowed so low, his forehead touched the mats. "My failure, my dishonor." A murmur rippled through the retainers. One of them smirked, another shook his head in disgust. Among samurai, to lose one's blade was worse than losing blood. It was to stand naked before the world, stripped of the ancestors' trust. The daimyo's tone deepened, sharp with fury restrained. "This is not only your shame. This is mine. This is ours. A boy from a peasant village has torn the pride of our clan in two. Do you think the world will not hear of this? Do you think our enemies will not rejoice?" Hayato's chest tightened. Words rose to his lips, but died before they could escape. He wanted to promise revenge, to swear he would reclaim honor with blood, but fear bound his tongue. Then, with a sudden gesture, the daimyo flung the shards of steel aside. The clang echoed like thunder. "If your pride has been broken, then you will mend it with blood." His blood. The hall darkened as if the torches themselves had dimmed. Warriors bowed, their voices rising in unison. "For the clan. For the daimyo." Hayato lifted his head at last. His shame still burned, but something colder had begun to take shape inside him. He was no longer merely the boy whose sword had shattered. He had been given a task, a sentence carved into his flesh by his lord's decree. As he left the hall, the fragments of his sword left behind on the mats, he felt the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. Across the mountains, Rikuya might have been sleeping, but Hayato did not close his eyes. In his dreams, there would be no rest, only the moment when steel would meet steel again, and blood would wash away disgrace. The sun had barely crested the hills when the first sound echoed through the valley. The heavy, deliberate rhythm of hoofbeats. A rooster crowed, but even that seemed drowned out by the arrival of something far more serious. From the fields, villagers paused mid-task, their gazes drawn to the road like moths to flame. At the main gate, the watchman raised his spear, only to lower it slowly when he saw the banner affixed to the rider's saddle. A golden crest shaped like flame, the symbol of the rival clan. The horse stopped. The rider dismounted with practiced precision, his robes dust-stained and damp with sweat. Yet his posture remained rigid, like a blade unsheathed. He offered no bow, no greeting, only silence. From inside his cloak, he withdrew a scroll, sealed in deep crimson wax. The old guardian of the village took it with shaking hands. The seal burned like a brand, and though his voice wavered, he read the message aloud in the village square. For the dishonor committed against our clan, we demand reparation. The boy responsible shall present his head by the third day of the coming cycle. If this command is not fulfilled, your village will burn. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind over dry grass. Some women stifled their sobs, pulling their children close. Men looked at one another with a mix of fear and fury. And at the center of it all, Rikuya stood frozen, the weight of the words crashing down like a mountain on his back. It wasn't just his life being threatened. It was his mother, his master, every soul tucked behind these wooden walls. One broken sword had become a noose around all their necks. The messenger said nothing. His gaze found Rikuya in the crowd. There was no malice in it, only the cold resolve of a man who knew the price of honor. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without looking back. The scroll slipped from the elder's hands, falling to the dirt. The red seal seemed to smolder, as if the paper itself had been scorched by fate. And just like that, the life of one boy became the bargaining chip for the survival of hundreds. The question now was no longer whether someone would die, but whether the village would choose sacrifice or defiance. And that night, in his own home, Rikuya would face another silence. The night after the messenger delivered the daimyo's decree, the village lay in uneasy silence. Lanterns burned longer than usual, as if their small flames could guard against the shadow looming over them. Rikuya walked home, through narrow paths, his thoughts heavy, his footsteps slow. Each house he passed seemed to watch him with shuttered eyes, as though the very walls carried judgment. When he slid open the door of his own home, the faint smell of rice greeted him. His mother sat by the hearth, her hands steady as she ladled food into a bowl. She had grown smaller with the years, her hair streaked with grey, yet there was a strength in her back that time had not stolen. She looked up briefly, her face calm but unreadable, and gestured for him to sit. Rikuya obeyed in silence. The tatami creaked beneath him as he settled across from her. She placed the bowl of rice before him, steam rising into the dim light. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of water boiling in an iron pot. He lowered his head, hands tightening on his knees. "Mother, I have brought shame upon us." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the sharpness of someone who had endured grief before. She took a slow sip of tea, then set the cup down. "Shame is carried only by those who survive it. Your father died with honor, and his name lives still. If you die with dishonor, then even your name will not remain." The words cut deeper than any blade. Rikuya's heart pounded, and for a moment he could not speak. His mother's gaze, firm and unwavering, pinned him in place. She leaned closer, voice low, almost a whisper. "You are born into this. Do not curse the path. A samurai does not choose his life. Life chooses him. All you can do is walk it without turning away." Her hand, calloused from years of fieldwork, reached across the small table and touched his arm. There was no tenderness in the gesture, only resolve. She was not comforting him, she was anchoring him. Rikuya swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her of his fear, of the weight crushing him since the sword had broken. He wanted to ask if there was another way, but the words died on his tongue. Her silence told him she already knew, and that she had accepted what he had not yet dared to embrace. The fire flickered, casting shadows across the walls. His mother poured him another bowl of rice, as if the simple act of eating could steady a soul trembling on the edge of destiny. She did not speak again. She did not need to. That night, as he lay awake on his mat, the taste of plain rice still on his lips, her words echoed in his mind. Life chooses you. And he understood that she had given him no permission to live or to die, only the command to face what was coming. Night fell over the village like a heavy cloak, as if even the sky understood the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Inside the wooden hall where the village council gathered, torches flickered against old timber walls, casting long, restless shadows. In the center, on a low table, the blood-red scroll sat unopened, its words already burned into every mind present. The room was filled with silence, thicker than smoke. Around the fire sat elders, seasoned warriors, and clan leaders, men who had survived both battlefield and famine, but now faced a threat they couldn't meet with steel alone. At the far end, Rikuya knelt, head bowed, fists clenched tightly on his thighs. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every word in that room, every decision, would either save him or condemn him. The elder who had read the scroll finally broke the silence. If we don't give them the boy, we all die. The Daimyo doesn't bluff. A scarred warrior, his face carved with the memory of old battles, snapped back. And if we hand him over, what remains of our honor, if we sacrifice one of our own out of fear, we are already dead. The arguments rose like a storm. Some pleaded for pragmatism, one life in exchange for hundreds. Others demanded principle. To offer Rikuya would be to sell their soul. No voice rang louder than the others. Only the fire, crackling in the center, seemed unmoved by the panic. Then at last, the swordmaster Hirotsuni spoke. His voice was low, calm, and resonant, like thunder heard from afar. A sword was broken, but it was not just steel, it was pride. Pride forged across generations. That kind of wound doesn't fade. It festers. He paused, letting the silence return before continuing. But remember this, if we yield now, if we surrender the boy, they will know we can be broken. Today, it is Rikuya's head. Tomorrow, it will be mine, and yours, and your son's. We do not trade lives like coins. No one responded. There were no easy answers. Rikuya's heart beat against his ribs like a caged animal. Was this what honor demanded? Was he proud to be defended, or terrified to be the cause of a war? Eventually, the council broke up, not with a verdict, but with uncertainty. Men walked out, carrying their silence like a burden. No final decision had been made. Rikuya was allowed to leave, but the truth followed him home. The village was split, and a divided village rarely survives the blade. And when he left the room, he sought refuge in the walls. The council had ended without resolution, its voices still echoing in Rikuya's mind long after the elders had dispersed. Some had argued for sacrifice, others for defiance, but none had spoken of mercy. The torches in the meeting hall burned low as men drifted back to their homes, each carrying the weight of a choice that had not yet been made. Rikuya walked out into the cold night. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and the moon hung pale above the valley. He followed the narrow path that wound to the village wall, the wooden palisade that separated safety from danger. The climb was steep, his steps heavy. By the time he reached the watchtower, the village behind him was silent, its rooftops like shadows against the earth. He leaned against the rough timber, his eyes drawn to the mountains in the distance. The peaks were veiled in mist, their outlines like ghostly guardians looming over the land. Somewhere beyond those ridges, the rival clan sharpened their blades, stoked their fires, and prepared to march. He could almost hear them already, the echo of drums that had not yet begun. The guard on duty offered him a nod, then stepped aside, leaving him alone. Rikuya gripped the hilt of his sword, the leather warm beneath his fingers, as if the steel inside knew it might soon taste blood. The night wind tugged at his sleeves, carrying whispers through the bamboo groves below. He closed his eyes and listened. To the untrained ear, it was only the rustle of leaves, but to him, it was the sound of questions he could not answer. Would he surrender himself to spare the village? Would he fight and see it burned? Every choice seemed a path to ruin, yet to do nothing was worse. His master's words returned to him. The sword is not steel. It is the soul. If that were true, then what had he broken in Hayato's blade? Only iron, or the soul of a man, the pride of a clan. The moonlight glimmered faintly on the flooded rice fields outside the walls. Their waters mirrored the stars, fractured by ripples of wind as though the sky itself had been torn and scattered. He remembered playing in those fields as a boy, running with Kenjiro, laughing without fear of enemies or lords. Now he stood above them as a marked man, a boy no longer, condemned by honor. He had not meant to wound. A dog barked in the distance. The sound startled him, though he did not move. His hands trembled. For the first time since the duel, he admitted to himself that he was afraid, not only of dying, but of failing, of leaving behind a mother who had already lost a husband, of shaming a master who had trusted him, of breaking the promise he once made beneath a sunset with his childhood friend. He exhaled, long and slow, and let the fear remain. He would not banish it. He would carry it, as he carried the blade at his side. For in fear he discovered a truth sharper than steel. Courage was not the absence of trembling, but the will to keep standing, even as one trembled. Near midnight, a thin wind combed the bamboo below the wall. Rikuya pushed himself away from the parapet and descended the steps. The village slept, but the dojo's single candle still burned. He crossed the courtyard, carrying his fear like a second blade, and went to his master. The moon hung high, slicing through the clouds like a silent blade as Rikuya crossed the courtyard of the empty dojo. The night air was colder now, as if the land itself had exhaled a long, uncertain breath. At the far end of the room, a single candle burned, its flame steady despite the wind. Beside it sat Hirotsune, unmoving, his silhouette like stone, carved by time. Rikuya approached slowly and knelt. He expected reprimand, a lecture. Instead, the old master let the silence stretch, long and unbroken, until the whispering of the wind through the bamboo sounded like ancient voices. At last, without turning, Hirotsune spoke. "Do you know what a samurai's sword truly is, Rikuya?" Rikuya answered, cautious. "It's his weapon, what he uses to fight." Hirotsune shook his head, not in anger, but in something closer to sorrow. The sword is not steel, it is the soul. When you shattered Hayato's blade, you didn't just break iron, you stripped him of the pride his ancestors placed in his hands. In times like these, that is more dangerous than killing him. The words struck like iron against his chest. Rikuya stared at the candle, watching the wax melt slowly down its stem. "So my victory was my undoing?" The master finally turned his eyes toward him, not sharp, but heavy with knowing. "There are no pure victories for those who follow the warrior's path, only choices. And now, yours stands before you. Will you be remembered as the one who fled from honor, or the one who stood for it, even if death came swiftly?" Rikuya said nothing, He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. Then Hirotsune gestured toward the corner of the room. There, resting atop a wooden stand, was an old blade wrapped in cloth. The master's own sword, untouched for years. "If fate demands it," he said softly, "this sword will be yours." Rikuya swallowed hard. It was not a gift. It was a burden, a sentence, written in steel. When he finally stepped back out into the night, the wind had turned colder still, and from far off in the hills, so faint it might have been imagined, came the low, rhythmic thump of war drums. He understood now. No counsel, no plea, no escape would change what was coming. All that remained was the choice. And then, as if speaking to himself as well, Hirotsune remembered. The candlelight flickered inside the dojo, painting the old master's face in shades of gold and shadow. Rikuya sat in silence before him, still haunted by the words about the sword being the soul. He had expected lessons of technique, advice on tactics, maybe even anger at his mistake. Instead, Hirotsune spoke of honor as though it were heavier than iron. For a long while, the master said nothing more. His gaze drifted past Rikuya to a corner of the room where an old wooden rack stood. Upon it, dust had gathered, untouched for years, except for the cloth-wrapped blade that lay there like a relic. His eyes lingered on it, as if seeing not just steel, but memories etched into its edge. "Rikuya," he said at last, his voice low, measured. "Do you believe I was always the man you see now? Calm, patient, content to guide children through their drills?" The boy hesitated, uncertain. "No, master." Hirotsune's lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "Good. Because I was not." The silence stretched before he continued. "When I was your age, younger even, I too thought a sword was only for victory. I lived to test myself against others, to cut down rivals and stand taller with each duel won. Pride filled me, and I mistook it for strength." He leaned closer, the flame reflecting in his eyes. "Then came a night like yours. A duel meant to prove nothing, watched by too many, remembered by all the wrong people. I struck my opponent harder than I intended. His sword shattered. He fell in shame before me." Rikuya's breath caught. The image mirrored his own fate too closely. "But the story did not end, as yours has not yet." His clan answered. "They came in the night, torches in hand. My village burned because of my pride." The words fell like stones into a pond, rippling outward. Hirotsune's gaze hardened. "I fought. I killed. I survived. But when the smoke cleared, I realized my blade had not saved those I loved. It had doomed them. The weight of that night has never left me." He gestured toward the cloth-wrapped sword. "That is the blade I carried then. I laid it down and swore never to wield it again, unless to teach or to guide one who stood at the same crossroads I once faced." Rikuya lowered his head, shame pressing against his chest. But his master's voice softened, if only slightly. "Do not mistake me. I do not tell you this to frighten you. I tell you because you must understand. A sword is not only yours, it belongs to every life it touches. When it moves, villages may fall. When it stills, futures may be spared." The candle sputtered, smoke curling toward the rafters. Hirotsune's hand rested briefly on the younger man's shoulder. "You are not the first to face this choice, Rikuya Takeda, and you will not be the last. But how you answer will shape not just your fate, but the memory of all who bear your name." Rikuya's throat tightened. He bowed low, forehead nearly touching the floor, words caught in his chest. The master had given him no command, no order, only a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw both his present and his possible future. When he finally stepped outside, the night air was sharper, colder, as though even the wind carried the ghosts of Hirotsun's past. The morning was heavy with mist, a grey veil that seemed to smother the fields and the narrow lanes of the village. Rikuya walked alone, the damp earth clinging to his sandals, when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. Before he could turn, a hand caught his sleeve. "Rikuya!" Kenjiro's voice cracked with urgency. His childhood friend stood before him, breathless, his simple farmer's robes soaked at the hem with mud. His eyes were wide, wild, the calm boy from the rice paddies now consumed by panic. "You cannot stay," he said, gripping Rikuya's arm as though holding him there would keep death itself at bay. "You have to leave. If you remain, you will be killed. Do you not see it? The Daimyo's decree is not an empty threat. They will come, and they will burn us all if they must." Rikuya pulled free, his face hard, though inside his chest his heart beat unevenly. "And what then, Kenjiro? If I flee, I live with shame. If I am spared, it is only because I abandoned everyone else to fate." Kenjiro's voice rose, sharper now. "And if you stay, your life is thrown away. Your mother loses her son, your master his student. His throat tightened. He faltered, then pressed on, softer but more desperate. "I lose my brother." The words struck deeper than any blade. Rikuya looked away, to the horizon, where the mist blurred the mountains. He could still hear the echo of their childhood vow. Promises shouted between swings of wooden swords under a dying sun. Kenjiro stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Do you remember? You swore to protect me. We laughed then, like fools, but I believed you. I believed in a world where we would both live long enough to see peace. And now, because of one duel, you would walk willingly to death. Tell me, Rikuya, was your promise only for the boy I was, not the man I have become?" Silence stretched between them. Rikuya's lips parted, but no words came. Kenjiro pressed harder, almost pleading now. "If you go to your death, what will that make of me? I will remain here with your ghost. Our promise will mean nothing but ashes. Is that the legacy you wish to leave me?" For the first time, Rikuya saw tears gathering in his friend's eyes. The boy who had once laughed at every misstep, who had teased him into training harder, now stood broken before him. The weight of choice pressed heavier. His master had spoken of honor, his mother of destiny, but Kenjiro spoke of something more fragile, more human: love, loyalty, the unbearable grief of loss. Rikuya reached out, placing a hand on Kenjiro's shoulder. His voice was steady, though his heart trembled. "I remember the vow. I remember every word, and perhaps the cruelest truth is this: to keep it, I must stand where death waits. For if I abandon my name, if I abandon honor, then what part of me would remain to protect you?" Kenjiro shook his head violently, tears spilling now. "Then let honor die. Let the code of samurai burn with their wars. What use is pride to the dead?" Rikuya said nothing more. He withdrew his hand and stepped back, his silence an answer sharper than refusal. Kenjiro's knees buckled. He fell to the damp earth, fists striking the mud. His cry rose into the mist, raw and broken, carrying the anguish of a boy who knew his brother in spirit was slipping beyond his reach. Rikuya turned, walking away into the fog. Each step felt like tearing away a part of himself, but he did not stop. Behind him, Kenjiro's sobs echoed, binding them not in laughter this time, but in the sorrow of choices neither could escape. And at the end of that night, he sought his father's presence. That night, unable to bear the weight pressing against his chest, Rikuya left the village in silence. The moon hid behind clouds, and the air was damp with the scent of pine. He carried no torch. He did not need one. His feet knew the path, for he had walked it countless times since childhood. It led to a small hill overlooking the rice fields, where a lone cedar tree stood. Beneath its roots lay the grave of his father. The mound of earth was marked by a simple wooden tablet, weathered and worn by rain, yet still upright, a testament to endurance. Rikuya knelt before it, folding his legs into Caesar, and placed his sword across his lap. For a long moment, he only listened, the wind sighing through the branches, the distant chorus of crickets in the paddies, the beating of his own heart. "Father," he whispered, his voice rough, "they say I have brought ruin upon us, that because I broke a man's sword, our people may burn." His fingers curled into fists against his knees. "I never meant to shame you. I never meant to drag your name into the mud. But now the Daimyo demands my head, and I do not know if I am ready to give it." The silence answered, heavy and unyielding. Memories rose unbidden, of the day his father had marched out in armor, tall and proud, promising to return, of the night when messengers came instead, bearing news of his fall, of his mother's quiet tears, and the way she stood straighter the next morning, as though she had no choice but to carry both her grief and her son. Rikuya bowed deeply, forehead pressed to the damp earth. "They told me your death was honorable, that you fought bravely, that you upheld the name Takeda. But what is honor if it leaves children without fathers and wives without husbands? What is honor if I too must die and leave nothing but another grave beneath this tree?" His voice cracked, and for the first time since the duel, he allowed his tears to fall. The soil drank them without complaint. Then, as the wind shifted, a strange calm washed over him. The cedar above groaned, its branches swaying, and in that sound he imagined his father's voice. Not words, never words, but presence, strength, the reminder that his blood was not only his own, it belonged to a line, to a people, to the weight of centuries. Rikuya straightened slowly, wiping his face with the sleeve of his kimono. He placed both hands on the hilt of his sword, bowing once more. "If my life must end as yours did, then so be it. But I swear this, I will not let my death be meaningless. If my blood must be spilled, it will be spilled for this village, for the name Takeda, for the promise I once made beneath a setting sun." The moon broke free of the clouds, casting silver light across the grave. The sword in his lap gleamed faintly, as though it too had heard the vow. Rikuya rose, his legs stiff, but his resolve steady. He bowed once more to the tablet, then turned toward the village below. The rooftops were dark, but in his mind he saw them burning, as they might if he faltered. He clenched his jaw. As he descended the hill, the cedar whispered behind him, its voice lost to the night. He did not look back. The path forward was clear now, lit not by torches or stars, but by the memory of a man whose honor still lived in his son. Before dawn could lift the night's veil, a low, steady rhythm began to roll across the mountains. The sound of drums, deep and deliberate, they pulsed like a distant heartbeat, making the earth itself tremble. One by one, the villagers awoke. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Instinct told them what the mind feared to confirm. The enemy was coming. From atop the wooden walls, the sentries were the first to see them. A river of flickering torches snaked down the slopes, burning through the morning fog. Spears glinted like needles, and in their center, tall crimson banners snapped in the wind. each one marked with the flaming crest of the rival Daimyo. The temple bell rang once, then again. The signal. Men dropped their tools. Mothers pulled children inside. Within moments, the entire village gathered at the square, staring toward the narrowing road beyond the gate. Rikuya climbed the wall beside Kenjiro and the other young warriors. His eyes locked on the army. Dozens, no, hundreds, moving in practice formation. The sound of armor clinking, the synchronized tread of feet, the distant rise of the drums. It was a symphony of war. Kenjiro's voice was barely a whisper. They brought the whole clan. Rikuya's gut twisted. He remembered the messenger's words. Deliver his head, or burn. Now that promise stood before him, in flesh and fire. One man broke from the formation, stepping forward with a tall staff bearing the clan's crest. His voice boomed across the silent valley. Bring forth Rikuya Takeda, or this village will be erased. Time seemed to freeze. No one moved. The torches danced. The drums stopped. Even the wind went still. Within the village walls, eyes turned toward the elders, toward the gate, toward Rikuya. Some wept. Some stood pale with dread. And behind them all, the swordmaster Hirotsune remained still as stone. His silence carried more weight than any cry of war. And Rikuya, hand resting on the hilt of the sword passed to him, knew the moment had come. No more questions, no more waiting. The enemy had arrived, and by sunrise, blood would follow. In the same night, hours before the torches would snake down the mountain road, shadows moved at the forest's edge. The sentries on the wooden walls were the first to notice them. Faint flickers of movement in the mist, the gleam of steel catching stray moonlight. Rikuya had taken his place among the watch, standing atop the palisade with a bow slung across his back, though his hand rested on his sword more often than the string. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, and every sound seemed amplified. The croak of frogs, the chirp of crickets, the nervous shuffle of men shifting their weight on wooden planks. Then it came, the sharp whistle of an arrow. A guard to Rikuya's left cried out, clutching his arm as the shaft pierced through flesh. Before the echo of his pain faded, more arrows hissed from the tree line. They struck the walls, the ground, the roofs of houses near the gate. Mothers pulled children inside, their screams muffled by paper doors. "Scouts!" someone shouted. "They're testing our defenses." Rikuya's heart thudded as he drew his bow, knocking an arrow with trembling fingers. He released, and the shaft disappeared into the mist. A muffled cry followed, proof that at least one shadow had fallen. Yet more emerged, slipping through the fog like phantoms. The clash was sudden. A group of rival warriors rushed the gate, blades flashing, voices raised in guttural shouts. The defenders met them with spears and clubs, the sound of wood striking steel ringing through the night. Flames from hastily lit torches painted the scene in frantic orange, shadows leaping across the wall like demons. Rikuya vaulted down to the courtyard, joining the fray. His blade met an enemy's with a jolt that rattled his arms. The man snarled, swinging wildly, but Rikuya countered with a precise strike, disarming him. The enemy fled into the dark, only for another to appear in his place. Beside him, Kenjiro, who had never lifted a sword in earnest, grabbed a fallen spear and drove it clumsily at an attacker. The weapon found its mark, and the man fell, writhing. Kenjiro staggered back, eyes wide with horror at what he had done. Rikuya seized his shoulder, forcing him to stand. "This is war," he said, his voice firm. "There is no turning back now." The skirmish lasted only minutes, but to those who fought, it felt like an eternity. When at last the horn of retreat sounded from the trees, the enemy melted back into the night, leaving behind only the groans of wounded men and the acrid stench of burning pitch. The defenders stood shaken, their breaths ragged. Blood stained the ground, both theirs and the enemy's. 2 villagers lay dead, their bodies covered hastily with cloth. The wounded guard leaned against the wall, pale but alive, while others scrambled to repair the gate. Rikuya wiped his blade, his chest heaving. He looked out into the mist beyond the walls, where the shadows had vanished. The skirmish had been nothing more than a probe, a warning. The true storm had not yet begun. As dawn's first light crept into the valley, the survivors gathered in silence, their eyes heavy with dread. They now understood that the Daimyo's promise was not an idle threat. His men were already here, clawing at the edges of their world, and when the sun rose fully, the weight of war would come crashing down upon them. But the real silence was yet to come. The skirmish at the gate left the village trembling. Blood still stained the earth when dawn broke, and smoke from hastily doused fires curled into the morning sky. Word spread quickly. Scouts had tested their strength, and though they had been driven back, more would come. By first light, the village had already changed. Laughter was gone. The air felt thick, as though even the birds had chosen to fall silent. The elders called for prayer. Bells rang from the small temple at the center of the settlement, their tones low and resonant, carrying over rooftops and fields. One by one, families made their way up the worn stone steps, their sandals scuffing softly. Mothers carried children on their backs, their small faces peeking out with wide, uncertain eyes. Old men leaned on canes, their bodies stooped, but their resolve firm. Warriors came too, some with fresh bandages from the night's clash still seeping red. Inside the temple, incense smoke hung heavy, curling toward the rafters like unseen spirits. Before the altar stood a simple statue of Cannon, the goddess of mercy, her carved face serene amid the fear that filled the room. Villagers knelt shoulder to shoulder, murmuring prayers that wove together into a low, trembling hum. The sound was not strong, but it was steady, a fragile rope tying them all to hope. Rikuya entered last, his sword at his side. His eyes scanned the crowd, finding his mother in the front row, her hands clasped firmly. Kenjiro sat nearby, shoulders hunched, his knuckles white as he gripped a string of prayer beads. For the first time since their quarrel, their gazes met. Kenjiro's eyes were red, his face drawn, but there was no accusation in his look, only sorrow and a silent plea that words could not carry. Hirotsune remained apart, kneeling closer to the altar. His lips moved silently, yet his posture was rigid, a man praying not for mercy, but for strength. His presence alone steadied Rikuya's breath. The priest's voice rose, leading chants older than memory. Drums sounded slowly, like a heartbeat, as offerings of rice and sake were placed at the altar. Children clutched their mothers, elders bowed low, and for a brief moment, the village became one body, united not by certainty of survival, but by the acknowledgement of their shared fate. When the prayers ended, no one hurried to leave. They sat in stillness, unwilling to break the fragile peace the temple offered. Outside, the wind had stilled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Rikuya stepped forward, kneeling directly before the statue. His voice was barely audible, yet it carried enough weight to reach the ears of those closest. If my life can shield them, let it be so. But grant me the strength to stand until the last breath. His mother's eyes closed tightly, as though sealing the words into her heart. Kenjiro lowered his head, tears slipping silently down his face. Hirotsune bowed deeper than before, as if in agreement with a prayer he too had once made. When they finally left the temple, the sky had shifted. Clouds gathered, heavy and dark, smothering the sunlight. The air smelled of rain, but none fell. The silence that followed was thicker than the mist, more suffocating than fear. It was the silence of people who had said their goodbyes, even if no words had been spoken. As the last prayers faded, a pale grey seeped into the valley. Torches guttered in the wind as the guards returned to the walls, not to rest, but to meet what dawn would bring. And Rikuya, standing beneath the looming gate, felt the weight of every prayer pressed upon his shoulders. He was no longer just one boy, no longer just the son of a fallen warrior. He was the vessel of their hope, and perhaps their final sacrifice. The world hushed as darkness fell. No laughter, no birdsong, no wind. Only the waiting, the last silence before the storm. The gates groaned open at dawn, their wood moaning as if reluctant to reveal the world beyond. Mist hung low over the valley, wrapping the earth in a pale shroud. Beyond it, the enemy stood waiting. Rows of warriors, banners snapping in the cold morning air, armor gleaming like the scales of some vast, dark beast. They did not shout. They did not advance. They only watched, the silence more suffocating than 1,000 war cries. From their ranks stepped Hayato. His armor was black, lacquered, polished to a mirror's sheen, a deliberate contrast to the shattered blade he had once carried. A new sword rested at his hip, but it was his eyes that gleamed sharper than steel. They were not the eyes of a humiliated youth anymore. They were the eyes of a man bound by vengeance, inflamed by the command of his lord. Rikuya Takeda, his voice cut through the mist, strong enough to reach the ears of every villager trembling behind the walls. You broke my sword. You shamed my blood. Today, I will take your life, not for myself, but for the honor of my ancestors. Rikuya stepped forward. His master's sword, heavier than any he had ever carried, hung at his side. Every step felt like a stone, pressed onto his chest, yet his back remained straight. Behind him, Hirotsune gave no nod, no word, only silence. The kind of silence that a mountain offers before a storm. Kenjiro tried to grasp his sleeve, whispering his name, but Rikuya gently pulled free and walked alone. The two men met in the open field between the armies. The ground was damp, soft beneath their feet, as though the earth itself braced for the blood it would soon drink. A circle of warriors formed around them, a ring of fate, countless eyes fixed on the duel that would decide more than just two lives. Steel sang as their blades were drawn. For a moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, the clash. Their swords struck with a force that echoed through the valley, sparks flying in brilliant arcs. Hayato pressed forward with brute strength, each blow meant to crush, to overwhelm. Rikuya yielded ground carefully, his movements precise, his mind searching for rhythm amid the storm. Each strike carried the weight of Hayato's fury, each block the burden of his village's survival. Blades whistled through the air, striking and sliding, their shrieks like the cries of tortured spirits. Sweat beaded on Rikuya's brow, mixing with the blood from a shallow cut on his shoulder where Hayato's blade had grazed him. The pain sharpened his focus, reminding him of Hirotsune's words. The sword is the soul. Hayato roared, driving him back, their swords locked in a brutal struggle of strength against resolve. Faces in the crowd leaned forward, breathless. Even the enemy warriors, who had come to see Rikuya die, could not look away. Then it came. The opening. Hayato, blinded by rage, overextended his strike, his balance faltering for the briefest instant. Rikuya saw it, seized it. He stepped in close, twisting his body, and with one clean motion, slashed across Hayato's ribs. The rival samurai staggered, his breath leaving him in a harsh gasp. His sword slipped from his grasp and clattered to the earth. He dropped to one knee, blood seeping through the black plates of his armor. His eyes rose, not with fury now, but with the hollow realization of defeat. Rikuya stood above him, blade poised at his throat. The crowd held its breath, the entire valley suspended in silence. A single strike would end it. One downward cut could erase shame, secure victory, and perhaps save his people. But in that stillness, Rikuya hesitated. The sword trembled in his hand, not from weakness, but from the weight of choice. He heard Kenjiro's cry, saw his mother's face, felt his master's steady gaze, and in his heart, he remembered the boy he had once been, the boy who had sworn to protect, not to destroy. Time froze, and the world waited for his answer. The valley had fallen into a silence so complete that even the wind dared not move. Rikuya's sword hovered above Hayato's throat, the edge glinting with the first rays of dawn. All around them, warriors stood, frozen in a circle, villagers and enemies alike, each breathless, each waiting for the blade to fall. Hayato knelt in the mud, blood seeping through the rents in his armor, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. His eyes burned with a flicker of defiance, but beneath it was something else, something raw and naked. The shame of defeat, the terror of being forgotten. To die here would be simple. To live with disgrace might be worse. Rikuya's arms trembled. He could feel every gaze pressing into his back. The weight of the village, the judgment of his ancestors, the cold expectation of the enemy. His master's words echoed again in his mind. The sword is not steel. It is the soul. And in that moment, he understood. If the sword was the soul, then to strike in vengeance would be to stain his own forever. He drew in a slow breath and lowered the blade. The motion was deliberate, defiant, a refusal to be bound by the cycle of blood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Warriors shifted uneasily. The rival commander's eyes narrowed, confusion flashing across his face. Hayato, still kneeling, stared upward in disbelief. "This life is yours," Rikuya said, his voice steady, though his chest heaved. "Take back your honor if you can. But remember this, I held your death in my hands and chose not to carry it." For a moment, the world seemed to sway. Then the rival commander stepped forward, his armor creaking softly. He was older, his face carved with lines of both wisdom and cruelty. He looked down at Hayato, then back at Rikuya. His voice was sharp, like a blade cutting through fog. "A samurai who spares his enemy, that is the burden you choose?" "Yes," Rikuya answered, unwavering. Silence followed. Then, with a curt nod, the commander turned to his men. "We leave." For now, the drum sounded again, this time not as a call to war, but as a retreat. One by one, the enemy ranks shifted, their banners fading into the mist. The ground shook as they marched away, their voices low, their gazes still fixed on the boy who had spared their comrade. Within the walls, villagers exhaled as if for the first time in days. Relief mixed with awe, though no one cheered. There was no victory here, only survival borrowed from the edge of a blade. Some wept openly, clutching loved ones. Others bowed their heads in silence, unsure what tomorrow would bring. Rikuya remained where he stood, sword heavy in his hand, blood from his wounds staining his clothes. He looked at Hayato one last time, the boy who had once been his rival and now was something stranger. Not a friend, not an enemy, but a mirror. Then he turned and walked back through the gate. That night, the season's first snow began to fall, soft, soundless, covering the scars of the battlefield in a white shroud. Alone, Rikuya climbed the temple steps. Inside, he laid his master's sword across the altar and knelt, the cold seeping into his bones. His whisper rose into the still air. "If my life is the price of honor, let it be so. But let this village live beyond me." Outside, the snow continued to drift, burying the footprints of the day, as though erasing them from the earth. And yet the story would remain, of a boy who broke a sword, who faced the wrath of a daimyo, and who chose not vengeance, but the fragile, costly weight of mercy. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more ancient Japanese legends, and leave a comment below telling us, where in the world are you watching from? What did you think of Rikuya's choice? Rate this story from 0 to 10. How much did it resonate with you? Your support helps us bring more forgotten tales from the samurai era back to life. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.